Hi, my name's Thete, and in this community forum what I'd like to talk about is the feedback that people are posting on the class and spec specific feedback forums for the Legion beta. Oh, right, first of all, it is really hot here. Like, get out from work to get into the car. It's one of the first day this summer. I've complained about it being hot before, but it's the first day this summer when I've actually got in the car, you know, the steering wheel and everything is hot to the touch. Getting close to 30 degrees Celsius, which for me is hot. I know there'll be some of you who think that's not hot at all, like from Australia or something. Oh, mate, not even hot enough for a barbie. But for me, that's really hot. I am absolutely sweltering. But anyway, on to feedback. Now, what I want to sort of cover here is what you see a lot of when you look at the feedback forums. It's particularly noticeable on the class and spec forums. And there's a lot of people, one common complaint is Blizzard not responding. And I'm actually going to do a post, would you believe it, defending Blizzard on this one. This is a defense of Blizzard vlog. So first of all, if you think about it, they probably can't respond to everything anyway, because imagine the time it would take. And you look at who is responding. It is on the class and spec feedback forums, it's Celestalon responding. We've had Calgan respond, but mostly it's Celestalon, the lead developer for that area. And obviously he can't be doing that all the time. Otherwise, he is neither leading nor developing. But it'd be nice, yes, I've always said it would be nice if they did it on a regular basis. Regular for me, obviously it's not responding to every post. It's not even responding on every build, but maybe like once a month if they touched base with each spec. And not just picked out the most ridiculous post where you're not actually adding anything to it. And we have had a response. We had a number of responses. 1 week, it wasn't like spread over a time. It was one particular week they thought, okay, let's talk to the rest. And that was some time ago now. But for other specs, I mean, there's some specs that haven't had responses for ages. Because I look on the blue tracker on MMO Champions, you can sort of see there are some specs that just don't seem to have had responses really from him at all. But when people do complain, I think, about Blizzard not responding, and whether it's right or wrong, you've got to bear in mind that, in actual fact, a lot of the feedback in these threads is pretty poor. I certainly wouldn't expect developers to wade through all this lot. Maybe some of the community managers do, and then maybe they forward some useful feedback to them, and then they go back and find it. I don't know. Even that, I can imagine taking a certain amount of time. But now, before I what I want to do is to go through some of the examples of what I think are poor feedback. Of course, this is largely opinion, but I think the fact that you don't really see them respond to any of these types of feedback adds a little bit of credence to it. I am going to say at this point, though, I'm not saying people shouldn't post this type of feedback, because I absolutely think you should be able to post whatever feedback you deem fit. It's just that when people sort of say, oh, look at all these responses, look at all this feedback, as if volume says everything, when in actual fact a lot of it is not the sort of thing that could ever, in your wildest imaginations, get an actual response. Now, the first one is, of course, on damage. Damage is the perennial thing, and I've had this with this week. Now, this has surprised me. Obviously, damage is up and down. They are still tuning. Yes, it's perfectly valid if the spec is not performing well. You don't just want... There's two extremes. There's the sort of people who will go, okay, damage is really low, this is really bad, we need buffing, even though we're in the middle of a tuning process, or maybe even before tuning even started. And you get the other extreme where you'll get people going, it's only alpha, don't sweat it. It's only beta, don't sweat it. And then the whole thing goes live in a crap state, and it's like, yeah, well, I'm sure they'll get around to it at some point. You don't want to be on either of those two extremes, really. You need to accept that tuning is going on, and every time they tune some abilities, some classes will get it wrong. You know, there's some classes that will do too much damage with a particular ability that's not expected. Some may do too little. This week, for example, with Ret, there's one particular talent that's not working properly. It's like supposed to reduce your Crusader Strike cooldown by 1.5 seconds, and it reduces it by 0.015 seconds. So there's like someone stuck a decimal point in the wrong place. So obviously, you can, you know, when you've got little things like that happening, that's going to affect your damage in a way that's not a tuning issue. It's just an error. It's a bug. So then we sort of think, and yeah. So I was looking at some posts and people describing the damage as being really low. This isn't specific to Retribution. I'm going to use that as an example because obviously that's what I main and therefore that's what I test most. And I'm thinking this is really strange because actually I've done some dungeons this build and been quite happy with the damage. It's pretty good. So then you think to yourself, so why do they think the damage is low and I think it's okay? And there's a number of reasons for this. It's not always the obvious one. I'm going to discuss the obvious one first, obviously. And the obvious one is maybe they're just a bad player and they're playing the spec wrong. And it doesn't matter whether it's DPS or whether they complain about healing output, not being able to keep people alive, or whether it's as a tank, you know, not being able to sort of use their active mitigation properly. They're taking too much damage, perhaps something like that. Easy to blame the spec if in actual fact you're playing it wrong. And there's a lot of people playing it wrong. I saw someone on a feedback forum saying that, you know, trying to offer feedback whilst at the same time making it clear that they are deliberately not playing the spec in the way it's supposed to, which is a bit like, strange, really. But that is only one reason. There are a number of other reasons. Like if you look, like when I do dungeons, I do logs now. I post the logs. You can look at my logs, and sometimes you look at damage, you go, oh, that's really low, and it might not be. There's a number of other things. Now, first of all, we have to bear in mind it's limited sample size. Even if you are testing, you are hitting dungeons several times a day, which I am not. But even if you were, there's only so many dungeons you're going to be doing in a week, and there's been tuning builds coming out most weeks, not all, but most weeks. And then you've got to bear in mind, you're also only testing so many talent combinations. There's loads and loads of talent combinations. So you've got to consider that Blizzard, when they are looking at numbers, when they say we think the numbers are fine, they're not basing it off running dungeons themselves. What they are doing is using simulations. Now, simulations aren't perfect, by the way. Simulations, because there's two types of simulations. There's simulations that Blizzard themselves would develop, where they don't have to second guess what abilities do. They know because they've done it. Then there's the simulations that theory crafters prepare, who are actual players themselves, who are going to a lot of time and trouble for us and themselves, but you know, it's for our benefit as well, to code simulations to test these things out. Now, you have to always consider parameters on things like that. They don't code it for specific fights. They usually code it for certain situations like pure single target, maybe some AoE, maybe some target switching, and things like that, different things. But what it allows them to do is to run lots and lots of iterations. They can run 10,000. It's as if you've done 10,000 boss fights, and they can do that, sim that in a few minutes. And they can do it with different talent combinations as well, and different gear sets. You know, they can change the stats that you've got as well. They can also change the traits if necessary. I don't think anyone is actually doing this outside of Blizzard, by the way, because that'd be a hell of a lot of work. I think a lot of the theory crafters, in fact, I'm quite sure a lot of the theory crafters are just doing this for fully upgraded artifacts. But yeah, you can't do this when you're doing it practically. You've got such a limited sample size. So you can easily have someone go into dungeons and get beaten on damage a lot because they happen to be grouping with people who are either better players than them or have got better equipment, and I'll come on to that in a moment, or are slightly overtuned that particular build. And you might get someone on the other hand who is playing against specs who either aren't being played all that well, or maybe they're slightly undertuned that build. So that can throw it out. And then that comes onto the equipment, because I think what a lot of people mistake is when you're doing the leveling dungeons, you're all scaled. So like the last dungeon I did it at level 110, but the last leveling one I did was 109. So my DPS was whatever it was, I can't remember now, on certain bosses. But if there's a level 103 in that dungeon, which I think there was, they wouldn't have seen my DPS as that. They'd have seen it as much lower, because all the damage that they're getting on an input is scaled to their level. It's as if we're all level 103. So that way you can compare yourself, but you have to be careful. There's a few things people aren't bearing in mind. So let's do as an example, let's say you have 2 level 105s in the dungeon. Well, everything's going to be scaled the same. All those mobs and bosses are the same for those 2 players. doesn't mean to say those two players have the same gear, does it? You can have one player who's in like 740 item level gear. You could have the other player in 760. That's 20 item levels difference. So you would expect one of those players to do more damage than the other, all other things being equal. Similarly, although things are scaled to your level, someone who's higher level, you might expect has gained more artifact power and has a better quality artifact. More traits unlocked, and these traits increase the damage of your abilities. So again, someone high level, you'd still expect to do more relative damage. It's only the level scaled, not anything else. So the quality of your gear and how well upgraded your artifact is, as well as the ability to play that spec, choice of talents, all these things factor in and can easily skew results. So it is worth bearing in mind. And that's for damage. Now, from that point of view, we cannot just go into dungeons and have any real idea about where our damage is. And a lot of us won't, because, you know, even though theory crafters are producing sims on a weekly basis and just testing things out, they're not really, and wisely so in my view, they're not really compiling them and comparing them to other specs and classes and putting that out there. That will probably happen before Legion launches, but until Blizzard stop messing about with talents and other abilities, that's probably not going to happen just yet. And that would be wise, and the reason I say that is because then they're done by different theory crafters. There's like different theory crafters for, say, Fury Warriors, and probably even Arms Warriors, perhaps, I don't know. But certainly between different specs and classes, there's a lot of theory crafters all feeding this information in. If one of them has done a more accurate job than another, then the comparison isn't valid. Whereas Blizzard's is, because they are using accurate data. They don't have to get someone to hit a training dummy for an hour to work out various coefficients. I know they have a theory crafting thread as well that Celestion started, where he does explain something. He does, you know, invite people to ask theory crafting questions, and so some people can get answers that way. But he doesn't answer all of them. There are some questions that get asked that are theory crafting questions that he doesn't answer. Again, maybe time, or maybe he just doesn't want to with certain things. But Blizzard's own internal ones will be fairly accurate. Does it mean they're valid? Not necessarily, because, again, there are different types of fight. And if all they're doing is comparing it on a relatively straightforward, what we'd call a patchwork fight, or a straightforward AoE fight, which doesn't even exist, then it wouldn't necessarily be valid. So we don't know that. They don't actually explain in detail what their internal testing takes the form of. Now, other types of feedback, I mean, that's obviously one of the main ones, but other types of feedback that have seemed to be quite common, and I think they are. And the first one is simply saying something like the spec doesn't feel fun. Now, obviously it's a game, and at the forefront of a game is fun. It needs to be fun. So why is that feedback invalid? Surely that's the most valid feedback of all. And in a sense it is. But the problem is that Blizzard aren't going to pay a blind bit of attention to it. Because you say, I don't find this fun. And they can answer, if they won't even answer, but if they did, they could easily answer, you don't find it fun. Okay, I'm sorry about that. But do you know what? A million other people do find it fun. They can just say that. They can just say, we disagree. Because it's a statement of opinion and not of fact. So... And here's an interesting thing. I thought, when I was sort of thinking about this, I thought of something. The first beta I ever tested in was Wrath of the Lich King. Now, in Wrath of the Lich King, when you were testing, at various points, like when you'd completed a quest or with other things as well, you got a little ding thing, a little poll would come up asking you to say how good that was. You were even asked how much you enjoyed it. So you weren't just asked for things like books. You were asked how much you enjoyed that feature. It doesn't appear now. You don't get that in betas now. I don't know whether that was just done for Wrath, because I didn't do beta for Vanilla or TBC. I didn't do beta for Cataclysm because I wasn't playing when that came out. I'd stopped by then. I don't remember whether it was in for Mod, but it certainly wasn't in for WoD, and it is certainly not in for Legion. Now, that basically tells you that, I have never been polled in the live game to ask me whether I like particular features, just from a subjective fun point of view. It's never happened. And they could easily gather that data. They could easily send out questionnaires to all players saying, on a scale of 1 to 10, how fun do you find this particular feature? Doesn't happen. Never happened. Never. The only questionnaires we ever get are ones where we've submitted a ticket and the GM's dealt with it, and then they give us a customer feedback survey on the quality of that GM. We never get ones on the quality of the game or the game design. So they're just not interested. They are point blank not interested. They used to be, and they're not anymore. Another one is, a common one is, this spec is bad or this ability is bad. And then they'll say, as their trump card, it'll never be used in raids or battlegrounds. Now, it may be true. We do know that there are certain specs that are largely absent from both high-rated battlegrounds or arenas and from raids, like top-end raids. That is a fact. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're wrong. It's just that saying it like that doesn't prove anything. What you need to do is to say, okay, I think this ability falls short because in this situation, and this is what I've tried to do. Now, I can't say it's with any sort of success, by the way, so I can't say that this is the only way, this is the way to get things done, but I see no other way. That this is the particular scenario under which this won't work, which is what I've done for both the judgment debuff, arguing for it being a buff, and things like that for my particular spec. But what is certain is if you just say, this is no good, it'll never be played in these raids or arenas or battlegrounds, whatever, they're never going to respond to that. Because they will just say, if they say anything at all, yes, it will. And it's as simple as that. So you have to state what the problem actually is. You have to state what the concern is. You have to state the very common situation under which it will not perform. And even then, they could easily turn around and say, we're comfortable with it not performing in that situation. Because the other thing to bear in mind is, and they have alluded to this in the past, in recent past, they're actually comfortable with the idea of certain specs not being competitive on certain fights. Now, my philosophy is that you should be able to choose to play any role you like, and you should be able to play any class that can play that role that you like. And you should be able to deal with any high-end competitive content. That means any fight in a raid, any fight in a dungeon, including the trash, rated, not necessarily one-on-one, because people like a lot of one-on-one in PvP, but that's not competitive. What is competitive is arenas. I'm not a PvP player. I don't know whether one particular bracket of arenas has the most prestige, but whichever it is, because I know it's hard to balance, because you think about, you've got to balance, you know, like if you're going to try and balance rated battlegrounds, well, that's huge, well, variable size really, but potentially huge raids of players, but also trying to balance that with like 2v2 and 3v3 and 5v5, but maybe balance it around the most prestigious. And I hear a lot about 3, so I'm guessing that's it, but I don't know. But I do think that every spec, not every, that's not necessarily true. Every class role combination should be able to compete, because otherwise you're saying to that player, that person, that individual, that customer, you can't take part in this content. Not because you haven't got the dedication to do it, not because you won't put in the time to do it, or you won't bother reading guides on how to play properly, or you just don't have the skill even, you know. I do think we should accept that sometimes we don't have the ability to play at a certain level. None of those things. Just simply because, do you know what? You fell in love with the wrong class. That's crap. But Blizzard are comfortable with that, and they've said that. So you have to accept that the argument of these things will not feature strongly in top-end guilds for raiding or PvP won't wash. They won't go with that. And then the other one that seems to be quite popular is redesigning the spec. Now, I'm fully of support of this as a creative process. I think it's a great deal of fun. I've not posted things like that myself, but obviously I think anyone thinks themselves, okay, if I got the chance to actually redesign my spec, how would I go for it? And of course I've got ideas on that, but I don't post them because I know it's not going to happen. But a number of people have. And again, it's one of these things I come back to. You can absolutely post whatever feedback you like. And I can understand the creative appeal of doing this. However, as long as you don't labour under any illusions that any part of this design will ever come to fruition. And the reasons for this are, there's a few. One is they have designed a spec. They are happy with that design of spec. Now, that's not to say that they're not prepared to tweak it here or there, but you're not going to, when you're presenting a whole redesign of the spec, you're basically saying to these developers, who are paid for this, by the way, so there's professional pride involved, you're basically saying to them, your work is shit. Utter tosh. I was sat on the bog for 5 minutes and came up with something better, and here it is. That's not going to go down too well. In fact, it will go down like a lead balloon. And it's no good thinking to yourself, okay, well, if I do this, maybe they'll pick some part of it, because that suggests that your overall spec design is not that well thought out anyway, because a spec design has to fit together like a jigsaw. You can't just take bits out because then it won't fit. So either your whole design is a template to work from, or none of it is. So that's why I think the best thing to do is to suggest tweaks. And there have, even though none of the things I've been really concerned about, and I think a lot of people for my spec have, they have actually responded to feedback. And this is what a lot of people forget. Now, I'm not going to talk about the specifics of that because this isn't supposed to be ret specific. But they have responded to feedback. It hasn't necessarily been the feedback that most people would most want them to respond to, but they have, and they have changed things. They absolutely have changed things. I've seen this for a number of specs. I've not paid attention to all 36 specs. God, no, I haven't got the time for that, and I haven't got the interest for that. But for the specs I am interested in, they have absolutely made changes based on the community feedback. And the community feedback has always, that they've responded to by making changes, has always been on the lines of, I don't want you to change everything. I just not so keen on that little aspect of it. And they've made changes that haven't conflicted with their overall design philosophy, so they don't get butt hurt. They've made changes that have responded to the community. In theory, everyone should be happy. And I think that's the only way to go about it. But the other thing about when you redesign your own spec, of course, you're not sitting, you know, I've never seen anyone yet do a whole redesign of a spec and then say, and in addition to that, I have prepared a simulation to show that actually it's not overpowered. Because you look at some of the abilities, you think, bloody hell, you're whacking on a bit there. So yeah, and if you're not going to go to all that trouble, again, Blizzard could easily turn around and say, won't work. Wouldn't actually work. Even if people like the design of it, it's not actually practical. So again, it's another type of feedback you won't get. And actually, when you take away all these types of feedback, so the feedback that's complained about damage, without every, and they, you know, Blizzard themselves say back it up with numbers, and I don't think they even mean logs. I think they mean sims. If you're going to try and say there's something wrong with the damage. If you look at things like just about talking about whether it's fun or not, again, we know they're not interested in that. If you're going to talk about like redesigning the spec, all these sorts of examples of feedback, if you take all those out, there's probably actually nowhere near as much feedback in the posts themselves anyway. So you can, coming back to my original point, you can well understand, you know, Blizzard employees who have to read through all this stuff thinking, bloody hell, because how much time do you spend trying to find useful bits of feedback, especially now, by the way, because now, I mean, they haven't announced a date for the release of the pre-patch. It can't be long. It could be as little as 5 weeks away. 5 or 6 weeks is a reasonable guess. They haven't got time to be tearing down specs. They haven't got time to be... At the moment, there are bugs. They need to make sure that... Because, you know, it's not... This isn't launching on the 30th of August. This is launching when the pre-patch launches. The Broken Isles and all the new dungeons and the new raids, all that's launching 30th of August. Well, not the raids, but, you know, that's not long after. The new content is launching then. But the classes and specs are launching sometime in July. Around about mid-July, you would think. So they ain't got long to do this. And as I say, they've got to make sure it also works, that there aren't loads of bugs in it. So they are pretty much settled, I think. I think they're settled on baseline abilities. They are still mucking about a little bit with talents, but even then it's not a massive amount. They're just literally tweaking talents, sometimes just moving them in the talent rows. And again, you could focus on feedback on that. If you think it would be better to move these two talents across with a reason why, they might be open to that. So it's just a sort of thing if people are thinking about responding. And of course, just because you don't have beta, don't think you can't respond. I have seen them actively respond to significant amounts of feedback on a particular topic on the official forums outside of alpha and beta feedback forums, by the way. Especially true if it's on the US forums, the North America forums, the English-speaking ones at any rate. So if you're able to post there, then absolutely they will pay attention to that. There's a possibility that if you're posting on other ones, there might be some feedback forwarded to them. But they do respond to that as well, so don't feel that just because you don't have the beta access that you can't respond. You can. So that's what I wanted to discuss, just sort of get that out there. And in terms of stuff for the rest of the week, as I say, I'm going to do a logs analysis at some point this week. I am needing to get more professions. I did the first professions guide, or the first part of a professions guide at the weekend. I need to get more stuff done for that. I wanted to do a bit on the professions, and of course it's going to need multiple characters. And I'm probably not going to be able to do the very detailed ones until like August, but that'll still be in time for the launch. But I do want to start getting some of these characters leveled up, and hoping there's not going to be a character wipe. Unless, of course, they bring in character copies, because then at least I have people who have all these professions at 700. So that would be a big help, actually. But yes, so thanks very much for watching. Don't forget, if you found the video useful or interesting, comment, subscribe, and like. And until next time, I'll see you later.